The discovery that would bring historians, treasure hunters, and curious onlookers from across the country to a humble rural town in Nebraska. A hidden bank vault from the 1920s that remained concealed for nearly a century. All because of one man's determination to rebuild his life after devastating crop failures and the old metal salvage yard that contained a secret concrete chamber holding what experts would later call the most significant Prohibition-era financial discovery of the decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The summer drought scorched the earth as Marcus Donovan drove his weathered pickup truck along the dusty road toward Clearwater, Nebraska. At 38, the third-generation farmer had weathered 5 consecutive seasons of diminishing returns. The combination of unpredictable weather patterns, rising equipment costs, and plummeting crop prices had pushed his small family operation to the brink of insolvency. The certified letter that arrived 3 weeks earlier felt like the universe's cruel joke. His distant cousin Walter, whom he'd met perhaps 3 times at family reunions, had left him a metal salvage yard and all related business holdings in this quiet farming community, almost 90 minutes from his struggling homestead. "That must be it," said Marcus, pointing through the heat-distorted air at a sprawling yard surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. A faded sign reading, "Donovan Metals Salvage," hung crookedly above the entrance. He pulled to a stop, killing the engine as disappointment settled heavily in his chest. He had hoped this unexpected inheritance might somehow alleviate the mounting pressure of his farm's financial troubles. Instead, he faced what appeared to be several acres of rusted metal, abandoned machinery, and what looked like decades of accumulated junk. "It's like a graveyard for old tractors," remarked his 15-year-old son Jackson, whose natural optimism somehow remained intact despite watching his father struggle to keep their family legacy alive. Since the drought began, the boy had thrown himself into the farm's operations with remarkable dedication, learning mechanics to keep their aging equipment functioning when they couldn't afford repairs, and researching alternative growing methods to combat the changing climate conditions. As they surveyed the property from the truck, a man in oil-stained overalls approached, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered its original color. He appeared to be in his 60s, with a weathered face that had clearly spent decades under the Nebraska sun and a thick gray mustache that seemed to have a personality of its own. "You must be Walt's people," he called as Marcus rolled down his window. "I'm Howard Gaines. Been running the yard since your cousin's health took a turn. Been wondering when you'd show up." Marcus extended his hand through the window, introducing himself and Jackson. "I'm Marcus Donovan, and this is my son. I didn't really know Cousin Walter well. Think I met him maybe 3 times at family gatherings when I was younger." Howard nodded knowingly. Walt was an odd duck, kept to himself mostly. Been in Clearwater his whole life, but always seemed like he was just passing through, if you know what I mean. He laughed, revealing a gap between his front teeth. Called himself a collector of America's industrial past, whatever that meant. Always going on about how every piece of metal has a story. "Did he actually make money with this place?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the cluttered yard. "Enough to get by. Called it a historical metal exchange rather than a salvage yard. Had some specialty clients, movie set designers, sculptors, restoration experts. People willing to pay good money for authentic period materials." Howard pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. "Want the tour?" The inside of the main building surprised Marcus. Unlike the chaotic appearance of the yard, the warehouse space was meticulously organized. Shelving units contained carefully sorted metal components, doorknobs, hinges, gears, and decorative elements, all labeled with approximate age, origin, and composition. One section housed vintage automotive parts arranged by manufacturer and year. Another area displayed what appeared to be architectural salvage, ornate metalwork from demolished buildings, cast iron fencing, and even vintage bank vault components. Walter lived here? Marcus asked, noticing a modest apartment visible through a doorway at the back. Moved in about 10 years ago after selling his house, Howard confirmed. Said he needed to be with his collection. Electricity works fine, plumbing's decent enough. There's a small kitchen and bathroom in the back. As Howard showed them around, Jackson wandered toward a display of early 20th century farm equipment parts. "Dad, check this out," he called, examining an old brass gear. "This is from a 1918 Fordson tractor, the first mass-produced tractors that changed American farming forever." His eyes lit with enthusiasm. "We learned about these in agricultural history class." "Your boy knows his machinery," Howard remarked, clearly impressed. Walt would have appreciated that. Always said the younger generation had forgotten where we came from. That evening, they ordered burgers from the local diner and continued exploring the warehouse. Marcus had called his neighbor back home to check on the farm and have him ship some essential items. Deciding they would stay in the apartment behind the shop for at least a few days while figuring out their next steps. The more Marcus explored, the more intrigued he became. Walter Donovan had maintained meticulous records of his acquisitions, including detailed information about their historical significance and provenance. One journal in particular caught Marcus's attention. It documented Walter's apparent obsession with banking artifacts from the 1920s and early 1930s, particularly those connected to small-town financial institutions that had failed during the Great Depression. "Dad, look at this," Jackson said, carefully examining an old blueprint under the desk lamp. "It's a layout for something called First National Bank of Clearwater, dated 1925. He traced his finger along the yellowed paper. "And there are these strange markings in the margins. Almost looks like someone was calculating dimensions or making notes about specific sections." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus studied the blueprint. His son had always had an eye for details, a trait that had proven invaluable on the farm when troubleshooting equipment problems. "You're right. These look like measurements, but they don't match the dimensions on the architectural drawings." Later that night, after Jackson had fallen asleep on the fold-out couch, Marcus continued reading through Walter's journals. One entry from 3 years earlier caught his attention. August 17, 2022. Professor Reinhardt confirmed the authenticity of the bank documents acquired from the Benton estate. The architectural discrepancies in the original blueprints align with accounts from former bank employees interviewed in 1972 for the Clearwater Historical Society. The phantom space between the main vault and the eastern wall appears to have been deliberately omitted from official records. The timing coincides with the Morgan Amendment legislation that required banks to report all storage facilities. First National's sudden renovation in 1926, just months before its mysterious insolvency, suggests something significant was concealed before federal inspectors arrived. The demolition was halted just before reaching the eastern section when the town ran out of funds in 1954. What remains was incorporated into the foundation of the current structures, primarily the hardware store and adjacent parking lot. Tomorrow I inspect the Peterson excavator. The bucket width might be narrow enough for preliminary exploration. Marcus closed the journal, his mind racing. Had his cousin discovered some kind of secret bank vault? Was this just the elaborate fantasy of an eccentric old man? Or had Walter actually been tracking a genuine historical mystery? And what could have been important enough to conceal in a secret chamber during the Prohibition era? The next morning, Howard returned as promised, bringing coffee and breakfast burritos from the diner down the street. When Marcus cautiously asked about Walter's research into banking history, Howard's typically cheerful expression grew serious. "So you found his journals?" he said, glancing toward the office. I wondered if he'd leave them for you to find. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. Walter was fascinated by Prohibition-era banking, particularly how small-town institutions navigated the complex legal waters of the time. Most folks thought he was just an enthusiastic amateur historian, but there were occasionally visitors who seemed very interested in his research. What kind of visitors? Marcus asked, keeping his voice low as Jackson explored the yard's inventory. Men in expensive suits who didn't introduce themselves properly. About 2 years ago, a couple of them offered to buy the business and all its contents for well above market value. Walter refused. Howard hesitated. After that, there was a break-in. Nothing obvious was taken, but Walter installed better locks and became even more private about his work. This information sent a chill through Marcus. He hadn't mentioned the journals or their contents, and now wondered if he should keep them secret, even from Howard, who seemed genuinely fond of his cousin. Later that day, while Howard minded the shop, Marcus visited the Clearwater Community Bank to access Walter's safety deposit box. Inside, he found the property deed, insurance documents, and a sealed envelope containing another key smaller and more modern than those to the shop with a tag labeled Storage Unit 8, Clearwater Self-Storage. The storage unit turned out to be a small climate-controlled space near the town's water tower. Inside were carefully organized filing cabinets and archival boxes, each meticulously labeled with dates and content descriptions. One entire wall was covered with a large corkboard, creating what looked like an investigation board from a detective movie photographs of historical documents. Building plans and locations connected by colored strings, with handwritten notes attached to each item. At the center was a reproduction of a letter dated March 1926, apparently from the bank's president to an associate named Thomas Calloway. The federal inspectors arrive next month. The vault must be sealed before then. You are authorized to implement the concealment plan as discussed. Select 3 men of absolute discretion, each to manage one aspect of the operation. The modified blueprints must be substituted for the originals, and all witnesses compensated appropriately. When the situation stabilizes, the contents will provide security for our associates' ongoing operations in the Western Territories. Surrounding this central document were photographs of historical sites across Clearwater, newspaper clippings about the bank's closure, and interviews with elderly residents conducted decades ago. Several modern photographs showed what appeared to be ground-penetrating radar, images of something beneath what was now the town's hardware store parking lot. As Marcus studied the board, he noticed a current satellite map with several locations circled in red. One circle marked the location of Donovan Metals Salvage itself. Another highlighted an area about a quarter-mile away, corresponding to the hardware store mentioned in Walter's journal. His phone buzzed with a text from Howard, man asking questions about Walt's research. Says he's from Historical Society. Never seen him before. Thought you should know. Marcus's heart raced as he quickly photographed the investigation board and gathered a few folders, labeled First National Blueprints and Calloway Correspondence. Whatever his cousin had been researching, others were clearly interested in it, and now they knew he had inherited the salvage yard. Returning to find Jackson helping Howard sort some new inventory, Marcus was introduced to Professor Alan Reinhardt from Nebraska State University's History Department, a tall, bearded man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Your cousin and I collaborated on several research projects, Reinhardt explained after Howard had left for the day. Walter was convinced he'd found evidence of a hidden bank vault from the Prohibition era that was never recovered or recorded in official histories. That sounds far-fetched, Marcus said cautiously, not revealing what he'd already discovered. Most hidden treasure stories are, Reinhardt agreed with a smile. But Walter had assembled compelling evidence correspondence between bank officials, architectural discrepancies in building plans, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and oral histories from elderly residents whose parents or grandparents had worked at the bank before its closure. He glanced around the shop. Did he leave you his research materials? Before Marcus could answer, the shop door opened and a well-dressed man in his 40s entered. He had the polished appearance of someone accustomed to authority, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he surveyed the space. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Richard Blackwood from the National Historical Preservation Society." He introduced himself, presenting a business card. "I've been corresponding with your cousin regarding some historically significant items he claimed to possess. I was hoping we might discuss the possibility of acquiring them for proper preservation in our secure facilities." Something in his manner, perhaps too smooth, too practiced, triggered Marcus's caution. He noticed Professor Reinhardt stiffened slightly at the introduction. "I'm still inventorying my cousin's collection," Marcus replied noncommittally. "I'm not making any decisions about sales until I understand what I'm dealing with." "Of course," Blackwood smiled. "But I should mention that items of national historical significance sometimes fall under special regulatory frameworks. My organization works closely with federal agencies to ensure proper handling of such artifacts." He placed his card on the counter. "I'll be in town for several days and would be happy to assist with appraisals." After Blackwood departed, Reinhardt's professional demeanor gave way to visible concern. "I should warn you, there's no legitimate organization called the National Historical Preservation Society. At least not one recognized by any reputable historical association." "Then who was that?" Marcus asked, glancing toward Jackson, who was now examining old farm equipment parts across the warehouse. "I'm not entirely sure," Reinhardt admitted. "But Walter mentioned being approached by people claiming affiliations with various historical societies who seemed extraordinarily interested in his research into the First National Bank. He became increasingly cautious in the last few years." The professor hesitated. "If Walter left you anything unusual, documents, artifacts, research notes, I'd be very careful about who you share that information with." That night, after securing the shop and checking that Jackson was asleep, Marcus spread the materials from the storage unit across the small desk in the back apartment. The Callaway correspondence folder contained photocopies of letters between Thomas Callaway and several bank officials, discussing the special security project and preparations for a regulatory contingency. One document particularly stood out, a personal letter addressed to Marcus himself, written in Walter's precise handwriting and dated just 6 months earlier. "Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, I've passed on and left you with what may seem like a burden, but is actually a legacy of immense historical significance. Your grandfather often spoke of your integrity and resourcefulness, qualities I've admired from afar through our limited family connections. What appears to be a modest metal salvage yard is actually the culmination of 15 years of dedicated research. The true value lies not in the merchandise, but in what it has helped me uncover. The office contains a floor-safe combination, 82,654. Inside you'll find my personal journals and the beginning of a path I've spent my life following. The Donovan legacy now falls to you. Choose wisely who to trust. Not all history is recorded in textbooks, and some secrets are meant to be revealed only by those who will ensure they serve their proper purpose." Your cousin, Walter, a secret safe? That seemed too dramatic to be real. Yet after everything he'd discovered today, Marcus couldn't dismiss the possibility. The office was small but organized, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a desk positioned beneath a window overlooking the salvage yard. A faded area rug covered most of the wooden floor. After some searching, Marcus rolled back the rug to reveal an old-fashioned floor safe with a manual dial. He carefully entered the combination 082654, and the safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing a stack of leather-bound journals, a small wooden box, and an envelope yellowed with age. Marcus carefully lifted the wooden box, which was about the size of a hardcover book, intricately carved with a pattern of interlinked gears. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay an unusual metal object, a brass disc about 3 inches in diameter, engraved with concentric circles and strange markings that resembled neither letters nor numbers, but something in between. "It looks ancient," he whispered to himself, carefully lifting it from the box. The weight of the metal felt significant in his palm. There was something else, a small compartment in the box's lid. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, brittle with age. As Marcus carefully unfolded it, he saw it was a hand-drawn map, the ink faded to a sepia tone. It showed what appeared to be a building layout with several locations, marked with cryptic symbols that matched some of those on the brass disc. Marcus picked up the most recent journal from the safe. Opening to the first page, April 23, 2024, They've verified the authenticity of the Callaway letter, confirming the brass calibration disc is indeed the measurement device described in the bank president's correspondence. The markings align with the anomalies on the ground-penetrating radar survey. The location of the sealed vault chamber appears to be precisely 17 feet below, the northeast corner of what is now Jameson's hardware parking lot. The soil composition and underlying bedrock would have made this an ideal location for concealment, stable enough for construction, yet positioned to avoid the town's water table and utility pathways. According to municipal records, no excavation deeper than 8 feet has occurred in this location since 1926, my research suggests. The First National Bank of Clearwater was secretly involved in financing various operations during Prohibition, not necessarily illegal activities, but certainly ones that required discretion in that complicated era. The bank's unexpected closure in 1927, just as federal banking reforms were being implemented, suggests the concealed vault may have contained evidence of these operations, possibly including significant liquid assets that were never recovered. Time grows short. The excavator is prepared, but I must proceed with extreme caution. The entry ended abruptly, as if Walter had been interrupted while writing. Marcus flipped through more pages, but the rest of the journal was blank. Had his cousin been on the verge of uncovering whatever lay beneath the hardware store parking lot when illness overtook him? Marcus sat back in the chair, his farmer's hands calloused from years of physical labor cradling the brass disc. What exactly had he inherited? Was this just the elaborate fantasy of an eccentric old man? Or had Walter Donovan actually been tracking a genuine historical mystery? And who was this Blackwood person, claiming affiliations with a non-existent historical society? The questions swirled in his mind as the reality of his situation came into focus. Just days ago, he had been a struggling farmer facing the potential loss of his family's heritage. Now he sat in an inherited salvage yard, holding what might be the key to a century-old secret buried beneath a small Nebraska town, a secret others seemed very interested in controlling. As the night deepened around the quiet salvage yard, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow he would dig deeper into Walter's research, and with Jackson's help, see if they could make sense of the brass disc and its connection to whatever lay beneath the hardware store parking lot. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond the grinding worry of crop failures and mounting debt. He felt the spark of curiosity and possibility. What Marcus couldn't possibly know was that Richard Blackwood was, at that very moment, sitting in his rented SUV, parked a discreet distance down the road, speaking quietly into a secure phone. Subject is access the storage unit. Surveillance will continue. Authorization requested for recovery team standby. The quiet rural town of Clearwater, Nebraska was about to become the epicenter of a hunt for a Prohibition-era secret that had remained hidden for nearly a century. And Marcus Donovan, third-generation farmer and reluctant salvage yard inheritor, was now at the center of it all. The early morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Walter Donovan's apartment as Marcus awoke, his mind still processing yesterday's discoveries. The brass disc sat on the knitstand beside him, its enigmatic markings catching the sunlight. For a moment, he questioned his own judgment. Was he, a practical farmer with mounting debts, really considering pursuing this mysterious vault when he should be focusing on saving his farm? The smell of coffee pulled him from his thoughts. In the small kitchen, Jackson was already up, studying Walter's journals while waiting for the ancient percolator to finish brewing. "Morning, Dad," he said, sliding a mug across the counter. "I've been looking at these journals. Uncle Walter's calculations about the hardware store parking lot are incredibly detailed. He was using ground-penetrating radar and something called magnetometry to map what's underneath." Marcus took a grateful sip of coffee. "You understand all that technical stuff?" Jackson shrugged. "Some of it. It's similar to the soil density mapping we looked into for the farm last year." The boy's knowledge sometimes surprised. Marcus Jackson had been researching modern farming techniques that might help their struggling operation long before Marcus himself had been ready to consider them. "I think we should check it out," Jackson continued, enthusiasm evident in his voice. Uncle Walter had already modified that old Peterson excavator in the back of the yard installed a narrow-gauge bucket that could dig precisely where he calculated the vault entrance would be. Marcus hesitated. The responsible choice would be to hand everything over to proper authorities, local historical society, university researchers, maybe even state officials. But the warning from Professor Reinhardt about Blackwood and his suspicious interest gave him pause. Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Howard stood there, looking uncharacteristically worried. "Morning, folks. Just a heads up that Blackwood fellow is parked across the street, watching the place. Been there since dawn." From the small window, Marcus could see the black SUV positioned with a clear view of the salvage yard entrance. "Thanks for the warning," he told Howard. "Any chance you know a back way out of here?" Howard's weathered face broke into a mischievous grin. "There's an old service alley behind the warehouse. Connects to the railroad access road. Used it myself many times when bill collectors came knocking in my younger days." 20 minutes later, Marcus and Jackson were bumping along the rutted access road in Marcus's pickup, having slipped out unnoticed through a gap in the rear fence. Their destination, Jameson's Hardware, to scout the location Walter's research had identified. The hardware store was a cornerstone of Clearwater's small downtown, a sturdy brick building that had obviously been expanded and modified over decades. The original structure, according to Walter's notes, had been built directly adjacent to the demolished bank. The parking lot beside it was small and unassuming, just a patch of cracked asphalt with faded parking lines. "Doesn't look like much," Jackson remarked as they pulled into a space across the street, pretending to be interested in the cafe next door. "That's probably the point," Marcus replied, studying the area. "If there really is something hidden 17 feet down, nobody would notice from the surface." After a casual breakfast at the cafe, during which they observed the parking lot from the window, Marcus made a show of stopping at the hardware store to purchase some basic supplies: work gloves, flashlights, and a few tools that might prove useful. Mr. Jameson, the elderly owner, brightened when Marcus mentioned his connection to Walter. Walter Donovan was a regular here, always poking around asking about the building's history, the original foundation, drainage systems. Thought he was just an enthusiast for local architecture. He leaned closer across the counter. "Sorry to hear about his passing. He was onto something interesting about this place, wasn't he?" Marcus measured his response carefully. "He left me some of his research notes. Seems he thought there might be historical significance to this area." Jameson's eyes twinkled. "Well, there's plenty of stories about the old bank that used to stand where part of my store and lot are now. My grandfather used to tell tales about missing money and secret rooms when I was a boy. He glanced around to ensure no other customers were nearby. Walter paid me to let him do some scanning of the parking lot last year. Never told me exactly what he found, but he was mighty excited. Would you? Marcus hesitated, then pressed on. Would you have any objection to us continuing his research? Nothing disruptive to your business, just some examination of what might be underneath the parking area. The old man chuckled. Son, that parking lot has more potholes than a prairie dog town. If you want to dig around after hours, you'd be doing me a favor. Just fill in your holes when you're done. He pulled out a business card and scribbled something on the back. My cell number. Give me a call when you're ready. I'll make sure nobody bothers you. As they loaded their purchases into the truck, Jackson spotted a familiar black SUV slowly cruising past. Dad, that's Blackwood. Marcus ducked his head slightly. Let's get back to the yard. I want to take a look at that excavator Walter modified. The Peterson excavator was an older model, but meticulously maintained. Walter had indeed customized it with a specially fabricated bucket narrower than standard, reinforced along the cutting edge, and designed for precision digging in confined spaces. The machine was small enough to be transported on the flatbed trailer hitched to Walter's old truck, which was parked beside it. Your cousin thought of everything, Howard commented as he helped them inspect the equipment. He was planning this dig for months. Had all the permits too. Filed them himself with the city for utility research and historical documentation. They're probably still valid. Marcus examined the paperwork Howard provided. These are legitimate excavation permits. Walter listed it as non-invasive historical research with minimal ground disturbance. He looked up at Howard. Did he ever actually use this setup? Was scheduled to start the week he took ill, Howard replied. Everything was ready to go. He even had arrangements with Jameson about after-hours access. He paused, studying Marcus's expression. You're thinking of finishing what he started, aren't you? Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. Professor Reinhardt calling with urgent news. I've been researching the organization Blackwood claims to represent, Reinhardt said without preamble. There's no National Historical Preservation Society, but there is a small private foundation called Historical Asset Reclamation Group based in Washington. They specialize in recovering historically significant financial instruments from defunct institutions. Financial instruments? Marcus repeated. Like what, exactly? Bearer bonds, gold certificates, banknotes, particularly those with potential modern value due to legal continuity issues. They operate in a legal gray area, technically legitimate, but ethically questionable. Reinhardt's voice lowered. They've been involved in several contentious cases where historical financial documents were recovered and then used to make modern legal claims worth millions. After ending the call, Marcus shared this information with Howard and Jackson. So whatever Walter found, it might have significant modern financial value, not just historical interest. Which explains why this Blackwood character is so interested, Howard concluded. Marcus made his decision. We're going to continue Walter's research, but carefully. Tonight, after the hardware store closes, we'll take a preliminary look at what's under that parking lot. Just enough to confirm if there's actually something there. He turned to Jackson. But I want you to stay here where it's safe. No way, Dad, Jackson protested immediately. I've been studying Uncle Walter's journals. I understand his calculations better than you do. You need me to help interpret the measurements from the brass disc. Marcus wanted to argue, but his son had a point. Jackson had always been the technically minded one, quick to master complex information. After some discussion, they agreed Jackson could participate in the initial exploration, but would remain safely above ground. As dusk approached, they prepared the equipment loading the excavator onto the flatbed, gathering tools, safety gear, and the brass disc that Walter believed was key to locating the vault entrance precisely. Howard agreed to remain at the salvage yard, keeping an eye out for Blackwood and creating a plausible alibi if needed. "Just be careful," Howard warned as they prepared to leave. "Whatever's down there has stayed hidden for nearly a century. Might be reasons beyond historical interest for keeping it that way." Under the cover of early evening, they drove Walter's truck with the excavator to Jameson's Hardware. Taking a circuitous route to avoid detection, Mr. Jameson was waiting as promised. The parking lot empty and temporarily blocked off with maintenance in progress signs he had arranged. "Got about 4 hours before anyone might take notice," the old man informed them. "The sheriff only does rounds through downtown around midnight, and I've told the neighbors to expect some noise-routine pavement work as far as they know." Working quickly, they positioned the excavator at the northeast corner of the lot, where Walter's calculations indicated the vault entrance would be. Jackson carefully aligned the brass disc with landmarks noted in Walter's journal, making precise measurements from fixed points on the surrounding buildings. "This is it," he declared, marking a spot on the asphalt. "According to Uncle Walter's notes, we need to dig straight down about 8 feet to reach the top of a concrete structure. There should be some kind of access panel or door mechanism." Marcus started the excavator, its engine surprisingly quiet thanks to Walter's modifications. With practiced skill from years of farm work, he began carefully removing layers of asphalt and soil, creating a neat hole about 4 feet in diameter. The first 6 feet were unremarkable standard layers of road base, compacted soil, and older construction debris. But at just over 7 feet down, the bucket scraped against something solid. "Cut the engine," Jackson called, shining a powerful flashlight into the hole. "I see concrete." Marcus climbed down from the excavator and cautiously approached the edge. Mr. Jameson produced a ladder, which they lowered into the excavation. With Jackson holding the light from above, Marcus descended carefully. The concrete surface was unmistakable, not the rough pour of a standard foundation, but smooth, engineered concrete with what appeared to be a metal panel embedded in the center. Decades of soil pressure had not deteriorated its structural integrity. "It's here," Marcus called up, his voice echoing slightly in the excavation. "Exactly where Walter calculated it would be." Using a brush to clear away the remaining soil, Marcus revealed a brass access panel about 2 feet square, with an unusual circular indentation in its center, exactly the size of the brass disc they had found in Walter's safe. "Jackson, hand me the disc," he called up. His son carefully lowered it down. The fit was perfect, the brass disc slotted into the indentation like a key. When Marcus applied gentle pressure and turned it clockwise, something within the mechanism shifted with an audible click. The panel itself began to move, rotating slowly to reveal a dark opening beneath. "What do you see?" Jackson called down, barely containing his excitement. "It's some kind of access shaft," Marcus replied, shining his light into the opening. Metal rungs embedded in concrete, leading down. He aimed the beam deeper. "I can't see the bottom from here." Mr. Jameson, who had been watching with growing amazement, spoke up. "My grandfather used to talk about the bank having some kind of special storage facility that wasn't on any official plans. Everyone thought it was just an old man's tale." He shook his head in wonder. "Walter actually found it." "We should call Professor Reinhardt," Jackson suggested. "He'd know how to properly document this." Marcus agreed, but before he could climb out of the excavation, headlights swept across the parking lot as a vehicle pulled in, despite the barriers. The black SUV came to a stop, and Richard Blackwood emerged, accompanied by 2 men in dark clothing. "Mr. Donovan," Blackwood called, his tone falsely pleasant. "What a remarkable coincidence finding you here. Conducting some after-hours road maintenance, are we?" Marcus climbed quickly up the ladder. "Mr. Blackwood, this is private property, and we have the owner's permission for our work." He gestured to Jameson, who stepped forward with a scowl. "That's right," the hardware store owner confirmed. I authorized this historical research project. Now who might you be, and why are you ignoring my closed signs? Blackwood's smile tightened as he produced an official-looking document. I represent certain interested parties with historical claims to financial instruments, potentially housed in forgotten bank repositories. We've been tracking the Clearwater First National's assets for some time. He glanced meaningfully at the excavation. I see Walter Donovan's research was as thorough as we suspected. Whatever's down there has been abandoned for nearly a century, Marcus replied evenly. I don't see how anyone could have a valid claim after all this time. You'd be surprised at the longevity of certain financial instruments, Blackwood countered. Bearer bonds, gold certificates, reserve notes, many remain legally valid despite their age, particularly those issued before specific regulatory changes. He stepped closer. My clients are prepared to offer generous compensation for cooperation in recovering these assets. And if we decline? Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. Blackwood's pleasant facade hardened slightly. Then things become unnecessarily complicated. My associates are prepared to secure the site pending legal resolution, which could take years. The threat was thinly veiled. Jackson had moved protectively closer to his father, the brass disc now hidden in his jacket pocket. Mr. Jameson stood resolute beside them, arms crossed over his chest. This is still my property, Jameson declared firmly. And I don't recall inviting you or your associates onto it. Unless you have a court order specifically for this location, I suggest you leave before I call Sheriff Gunderson. Blackwood hesitated, measuring the situation. His associates looked ready for confrontation, but the mention of local law enforcement gave him pause. We'll return tomorrow with appropriate documentation, he finally said. I strongly advise against removing anything from the site in the meantime. After Blackwood and his men reluctantly departed, Marcus, Jackson, and Mr. Jameson held a hurried conference. They'll be back with whatever paperwork they think will give them control, Jameson warned. Blackwood strikes me as the type who can find a friendly judge to sign whatever he needs. Then we need to document what's down there tonight, Marcus decided. Create a record that can't be easily suppressed. He turned to Jackson. Call Professor Reinhardt. Tell him to bring whatever equipment he needs to properly document this discovery. Within an hour, Reinhardt arrived with a graduate student assistant and professional documentation equipment cameras, measuring tools, and a small drone with lighting capabilities that could be lowered into tight spaces. This is extraordinary, Reinhardt breathed as he examined the access shaft. The construction is consistent with mid-1920s bank vault engineering, but this concealment mechanism is unique. I've never seen anything like it. While Reinhardt and his assistant began systematic documentation, Marcus descended the shaft again, this time with improved lighting. The metal rungs led down another 10 feet before opening into a small antechamber. The beam of his powerful flashlight revealed walls of reinforced concrete and a heavy metal door with another circular locking mechanism. There's a second door down here, he called up. Similar lock to the first one. Jackson carefully lowered the brass disc again. This time, when Marcus inserted it into the mechanism, nothing happened. It's not working, he reported. The disc fits the indentation, but nothing's engaging. Reinhardt climbed down to examine the door. The mechanism might be aligned differently, he suggested. Walter's journals mentioned the disc having multiple configurations. He studied the markings on the disc carefully. Try rotating the outer ring of the disc before inserting it. Marcus adjusted the disc as suggested, aligning different symbols, and tried again. On the third attempt, when a particular symbol aligned with what appeared to be a north marker, the mechanism engaged. The heavy door began to move, revealing darkness beyond. The air that escaped from the opening was stale but dry. The chamber had been remarkably well sealed. As Marcus shone his light through the doorway, the beam reflected off metal surfaces within. "Professor," he called up. "You need to see this." Reinhardt joined him, and together they stepped through the doorway into what was unmistakably a bank vault, but unlike any they had seen before. Instead of the expected shelving or safety deposit boxes, the room contained what appeared to be specialized storage containers, each sealed with similar circular locks. "These aren't standard bank fixtures," Reinhardt whispered, his academic detachment momentarily forgotten in pure amazement. This vault wasn't designed for routine banking operations. It was built specifically to conceal something. Marcus approached the nearest container, a metal cabinet about 4 feet tall with a brass plate inscription. "Clearwater First National Bank, Contingency Reserve, March 1926. Using the disc once more, he unlocked it. Inside, neatly arranged in protective sleeves, were stacks of documents and financial instruments, bearer bonds, gold certificates, and land deeds, all dating from the mid-1920s. A leather-bound ledger sat atop the papers. Reinhardt carefully opened the ledger, his hands now gloved for preservation. "This appears to be an accounting of assets moved from the bank's official records before federal inspectors arrived," he explained, turning pages carefully. According to these entries, the bank's directors anticipated financial regulations that would have revealed certain unconventional banking practices. "Illegal practices?" Marcus asked. "Not necessarily illegal at the time," Reinhardt clarified. During Prohibition, many small banks operated in gray areas, providing financial services for businesses that straddled the line between legitimate and illicit operations. Breweries converting to medicinal production, shipping companies with multiple books, agricultural suppliers whose products might be diverted to underground distilleries. As they explored further, the true nature of the hidden vault became clear. It wasn't simply a place to stash questionable assets, it was an elaborate contingency system created by forward-thinking bankers who anticipated both the financial crash that would come in 1929 and the banking reforms that would follow. "These people weren't criminals," Reinhardt explained, his voice filled with growing excitement as he examined more documents. "They were pragmatists creating a financial safety net for their community, operating outside increasingly restrictive banking regulations. When the bank officially failed in 1927, these resources remained hidden, protected from both government seizure and private exploitation." "But why wasn't it ever recovered?" Jackson called down from the top of the shaft, where he was monitoring the drone camera feed. "According to this," Reinhardt said, indicating a sealed letter he had carefully opened, "the original access mechanisms were lost when the bank president died unexpectedly in 1927. His successor knew of the vault's existence, but not its exact location or access methods." Marcus stared at the contents of the vault, the implications slowly dawning on him. "So all of this, these financial instruments, property deeds, whatever else is stored here, it's been sitting untouched for nearly a century. And potentially still legally valid," Reinhardt confirmed, which explains Blackwood's interest. His organization specializes in recovering historical financial instruments and leveraging them for modern value, sometimes through legitimate channels, sometimes through legal loopholes that the original regulations never anticipated. As they continued documenting the vault's contents, Marcus realized they had uncovered something far more significant than a simple cash repository. They had found a carefully constructed financial time capsule, a system designed to preserve community resources against economic disaster, hidden away and then lost to history when its creators could no longer access it. What began as a curious inheritance from a distant cousin had led to a discovery that could potentially reshape the economic future of Clearwater and possibly Marcus's own struggling circumstances. But with Blackwood and his associates circling, the question remained, who had the rightful claim to this forgotten fortune? And how could they ensure it served its intended purpose rather than disappearing into the hands of modern-day financial predators? The night was growing late, but their work had only just begun. Dawn was breaking over Clearwater as Marcus Jackson and Professor Reinhardt emerged from the underground chamber, exhausted but exhilarated by their discovery. They had spent the night meticulously documenting the vault's contents, photographing documents, creating inventory lists, and securing digital evidence of everything they found. Mr. Jameson had remained loyally on guard, occasionally bringing them coffee and sandwiches from the all-night diner down the street. "We need to secure the site," Reinhardt said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Blackwood will be back, likely with some kind of legal paperwork that appears legitimate, even if it isn't." Marcus nodded, staring thoughtfully at the excavation. "I've been thinking about that. We need to buy time while we figure out the legal implications of what we've found." He turned to Jameson. "Any chance we could make this look like an abandoned dig site? Like we didn't find anything worth pursuing?" The hardware store owner scratched his chin. "I've got some old concrete mix in the back. We could fill in just enough to cover the access panel, but not damage it. Make it look like you hit nothing but foundation and gave up." While Jameson prepared the temporary concealment, Reinhardt made several calls to colleagues, a law professor specializing in historical financial instruments and a curator from the State Museum who had expertise in banking artifacts. "This is unprecedented," Reinhardt explained as they worked. "The financial instruments in that vault, particularly the bearer bonds and gold certificates, exist in a complex legal space. Some may have been rendered invalid by subsequent banking reforms, but others might retain legal value through grandfather clauses and statutory limitations." "In English, please," Marcus requested, helping Jackson load their documentation equipment into Reinhardt's car. "Some of those papers might still be worth a lot of money," the professor clarified. "But determining who has legitimate claim to them is complicated. Technically, they belong to the bank, which failed in 1927, but the bank's assets would have been managed by receivers, and any unclaimed assets eventually escheated to the state. However, since these particular assets were deliberately concealed and never included in official records, they might not legally exist at all," Marcus finished the thought. "Exactly. And that creates both opportunity and danger. Blackwood and his clients are almost certainly planning to exploit this legal ambiguity." Reinhardt's expression grew serious. "But there's more at stake here than just the financial instruments. The historical significance of this discovery is extraordinary, a perfectly preserved Prohibition-era banking vault with its contents intact. It belongs in a museum, not carved up by private interests." By mid-morning, they had concealed the access panel with a thin layer of quick-setting concrete and arranged debris to make it appear that the excavation had been abandoned after hitting nothing but foundation material. Jameson placed pavement repair complete signs around the now-filled hole, making it seem like routine maintenance. They retreated to Walter's apartment at the salvage yard to review their findings and develop a strategy. Howard greeted them with fresh coffee and news that Blackwood had been asking questions around town about Marcus and the excavator. "He's been showing some official-looking paperwork to folks at the diner," Howard reported. "Something about historical asset recovery authorization. Most people weren't impressed. Clearwater folks don't much trust men in suits flashing fancy documents." Marcus spread the photos and inventory lists across Walter's desk. The vault contents were more extensive than they had initially realized, not just financial instruments, but detailed records of land purchases, mineral rights agreements, and what appeared to be investment plans for regional development. "This wasn't just about hiding questionable transactions," Reinhardt observed, examining the digital copies. "The bankers were creating a financial reserve for the community's future. Development investments that would mature over decades rather than years." "Like a time capsule of opportunity," Jackson added, his young face thoughtful beyond his years. They were thinking generations ahead. A particular document caught Marcus's attention, a letter from the bank's president to the board of directors. Dated January 1926. "Gentlemen, As financial regulations tighten and our ability to make independent judgments about community investment diminishes, we find ourselves at a crossroads. The coming years will bring challenges that conventional banking cannot weather. Our contingency vault represents not an evasion of responsibility, but a commitment to it, a promise that should our formal institutions fail, the foundation for rebuilding will remain secure. The assets contained herein are not ours alone, but held in trust for the future prosperity of Clearwater and its citizens. Should circumstances require their deployment, let them be administered with wisdom and foresight rather than immediate advantage. They knew, Marcus said softly. They somehow knew the crash was coming years before it happened. Not necessarily the crash specifically, Reinhardt corrected. But they recognized that banking was changing, becoming more centralized and less responsive to local needs. They were creating a safeguard against that centralization. Marcus's phone rang a local number he didn't recognize. The caller identified himself as Sheriff Dale Gunderson. "Mr. Donovan, I understand you've been conducting some excavation at Jameson's Hardware," the sheriff said, his tone neutral but authoritative. "I've got a gentleman here with me, a Mr. Blackwood, who's presenting some concerning claims about historical artifacts being removed from the site without proper authorization." "We have all the necessary permits for the work we did," Marcus replied carefully. "Mr. Jameson authorized the excavation himself. It was just routine exploration of the old foundation. Nothing of significance was found." There was a pause. "I see. Well, Mr. Blackwood has documentation that suggests otherwise. Claims to represent something called the Historical Asset Reclamation Group. Says they have legal interest in anything found at that location." "Sheriff," Marcus said, an idea forming, "why don't we meet to discuss this properly? I'd be happy to show you our permits and documentation, and I'm sure Professor Reinhardt from Nebraska State University would be willing to explain the historical research project we're conducting." The meeting was arranged for noon at the sheriff's office. Before heading there, Marcus, Jackson, Reinhardt, and Howard held a strategy session. "We need to be selective about what we reveal," Reinhardt advised. "The sheriff seems straightforward, but we don't know how Blackwood might twist information." "What about the brass disc?" Jackson asked. "It's the key to the vault." "Should we bring it?" Marcus shook his head. "That stays secure here. Howard, can you hide it somewhere safe while we're gone?" The older man nodded solemnly. "I know just the place." Walter had several hidden compartments built throughout the yard places to stash valuable items that even thieves familiar with salvage operations wouldn't think to check. Before departing for the meeting, Marcus pulled Jackson aside. "This situation is getting complicated, son. I'm thinking maybe you should stay here with Howard." The boy squared his shoulders. "Dad, I'm part of this now. Uncle Walter's journals make more sense to me than anyone else, and I understand the technical aspects of what we found. You need me there." Marcus recognized the determination in his son's eyes, the same determination that had kept the boy working alongside him on the farm through drought and hardship without complaint. Jackson had earned his place in this adventure. "All right," he conceded. "But follow my lead, okay?" Sheriff Gunderson's office was housed in a small, well-maintained building on Clearwater's main street. The sheriff himself was a man in his 50s with a weathered face, shrewd eyes, and the measured movements of someone who preferred to think before acting. Blackwood was already there, along with a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Catherine Mercer, legal counsel for the Historical Asset Reclamation Group. "Thank you for coming in." "Mr. Donovan," Sheriff Gunderson began after introductions were complete, "we seem to have a situation with competing claims about historical artifacts. I'd like to understand exactly what's going on before anything escalates." Marcus presented their excavation permits and explained their research project, carefully framing it as an academic exploration of historical banking practices rather than a treasure hunt. Professor Reinhardt's department at Nebraska State has been studying small-town banking evolution during Prohibition. He explained. My cousin Walter had been assisting with research before his passing. We're simply continuing his work. And did this academic research happen to uncover a concealed bank vault beneath Jameson's parking lot? Blackwood interrupted, his tone insinuating. Before Marcus could respond, Reinhardt stepped in smoothly. We found evidence of foundation structures consistent with period banking architecture, yes. But nothing beyond what would be expected from a demolished building of that era. Blackwood smiled thinly and slid a folder across the table. Sheriff, my organization has been tracking the dissolution of First National Bank of Clearwater for several years. We have documentation indicating the bank concealed assets before its failure assets that legally should have been distributed to creditors. That was nearly 100 years ago, Marcus pointed out. Even if such assets existed, how could your organization possibly have a valid claim? Catherine Mercer opened her own leather portfolio. The Historical Asset Reclamation Group represents the legal successors to several of First National's major creditors. Under Nebraska Statute 25-205, instruments under seal or bonds have a statute of limitations of 10 years, but that period only begins when the cause of action accrues. Since these assets were deliberately concealed, the statutory clock would only start upon discovery. Sheriff Gunderson frowned. I'm no lawyer, but that sounds like a stretch for something from the 1920s. The courts have upheld similar claims in other cases, Mercer insisted. We're simply requesting that any discovered assets be secured pending legal determination of ownership. Jackson, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. If your organization is so concerned about proper legal channels, why did Mr. Blackwood try to intimidate us at the excavation site last night? And why has he been following us since we arrived in town? The sheriff's eyebrows rose as he looked to Blackwood for explanation. Standard asset security protocols, Blackwood replied smoothly. When significant historical discoveries are imminent, documentation of the chain of custody becomes crucial. So you admit you knew exactly what we'd find before we found it, Marcus noted. Interesting, given that my cousin's research wasn't publicly available. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Professor Reinhardt placed his own folder on the table. Sheriff, I believe you should know that the university has already filed preliminary documentation with the State Historical Society regarding this research site. Any artifacts or documents discovered would fall under standard archaeological protocols, which require professional assessment before any claims of ownership are adjudicated. The meeting continued for another hour, with complex legal arguments from both sides. Sheriff Gunderson, clearly out of his depth in the specialized legal discussion, but unwilling to be manipulated, finally held up his hands. Here's how we'll proceed, he announced. I'm issuing a temporary preservation order for the excavation site, no further digging or removal of materials, until a proper determination can be made by qualified authorities. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Donovan, I'll need a detailed inventory of anything already removed from the site. Of course, Marcus agreed, relieved that the sheriff seemed fair-minded. Professor Reinhardt has documentation of our work. And Mr. Blackwood, the sheriff continued, I'll need to verify your organization's legal standing before I can consider your request for site control. Please have your headquarters forward complete corporate registration and authorization documents to my office. As they left the meeting, Blackwood approached Marcus in the hallway. This is merely a delay, he said quietly. My organization has resources and connections you can't imagine. We can make this very simple. Cooperate with us, turn over the access mechanism, and we're prepared to offer you 20% of the recoverable value. Could solve those farm troubles I hear you're having. How do you know about my farm? Marcus asked, tension rising in his shoulders. Blackwood smiled. We do thorough research, Mr. Donovan. Your struggling operation, the pending loan reviews, the equipment about to be repossessed, all matters of public record. This discovery could be your financial salvation, but only if you're pragmatic about it. Before Marcus could respond, Jackson stepped between them. "My dad doesn't need your kind of salvation," the boy said firmly. "We know what Uncle Walter found, and it wasn't meant for people like you." Back at the salvage yard, Howard had news of his own. "While you were meeting with the sheriff, I had some visitors, 3 older folks who said they knew Walter. Said they heard his cousin was in town and wanted to pay their respects." He handed Marcus a business card. "Eleanor Caldwell. Said she's on the town council." A quick call to the number confirmed that. Miss Caldwell and her associates, all longtime Clearwater residents in their 70s or 80s, wanted to meet privately that evening. "We have information about Walter's research that you should know," she said cryptically. "Information that Mr. Blackwood would very much like to suppress." As dusk fell over the salvage yard, 3 elderly visitors arrived in a meticulously maintained vintage Cadillac. Eleanor Caldwell was a dignified woman with silver hair and alert eyes that missed nothing. Her companions introduced themselves as Henry Fitzgerald, former president of Clearwater's small community bank, and Dr. Martha Wilson, the town's retired physician and local historian. "Walter was more than a collector of metal," Eleanor began once they were settled in the apartment. "He was a curator of Clearwater's hidden history, particularly the story of how this town survived the Depression when so many others didn't. We were founding members of what Walter called the Continuity Circle," Henry explained, "a group dedicated to preserving the truth about First National and its legacy." Martha Wilson opened an ancient leather briefcase and removed a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs. "Clearwater should have collapsed after First National failed in 1927, she explained. "Most similar towns did. But somehow, key local businesses secured emergency financing. The grain elevator stayed open. The general store extended credit to farmers. The medical practice remained staffed. My grandfather was on the town council then," Eleanor continued. "He kept a private journal. Said the town had a guardian angel, someone providing strategic investments exactly when needed, always anonymously through various proxies." The pieces began to fit together in Marcus's mind. "The contingency vault," he said softly. "Someone was using those resources to keep the town afloat." Henry nodded. "The bank president's son, James Calloway. He was just 22 when his father died in 1927, but he'd been entrusted with knowledge of the vault's existence, if not its exact location or access methods. He couldn't recover the entire cash," Martha added, "but his father had apparently removed certain key instruments before the final sealing. Just enough to establish a small, private lending operation that functioned under the radar during the worst years of the Depression. The Clearwater Community Trust," Henry confirmed. "It existed for decades, gradually evolving into a scholarship fund, a small business incubator, and eventually, the Historical Preservation Committee Walter worked with." Eleanor leaned forward intently. "What you've found isn't just financially valuable, Mr. Donovan. It's the missing piece of our town's survival story, proof that when the formal financial system failed, our predecessors created an alternative based on community need rather than profit. And that's exactly what Blackwood and his people want to prevent becoming public knowledge," Henry added grimly. "Their business model depends on exploiting forgotten financial instruments. The idea that such instruments might have been deliberately deployed for community benefit rather than private gain threatens their entire approach." The revelation landed heavily in the room. Marcus looked at Jackson, seeing the same understanding dawn in his son's eyes. What they had discovered wasn't just a hidden treasure, it was evidence of an alternative, economic model that had quietly sustained a community through one of history's greatest financial collapses. "What do you suggest we do?" Marcus asked. Eleanor exchanged glances with her companions before answering. We believe the contents of the vault should be properly documented by historical authorities and financial experts, then used as they were intended for the benefit of this community, not distant creditors or opportunistic asset hunters. There are legal mechanisms, Henry added. Community trusts, historical endowments, ways to ensure these resources serve their intended purpose while acknowledging their complex legal status. As they discussed potential approaches, Howard burst into the apartment, his weathered face tense with alarm. "We've got trouble," he announced. "Just got a call from Jameson. Men claiming to be federal banking authorities are at the hardware store with excavation equipment. They've got papers ordering immediate access to the site for emergency assessment of potentially unstable historical banking infrastructure." "Blackwood," Marcus concluded grimly. "He's making his move using fake federal credentials." "The sheriff's out of town until morning," Howard added. "Emergency call to a ranching accident outside county lines." Eleanor Caldwell rose with surprising agility for her age. "Then we need the community," she declared, pulling out her phone. "Clearwater protects its own." What followed was a remarkable demonstration of small-town solidarity. As Marcus Jackson and Professor Reinhardt rushed to the hardware store, they found Jameson standing resolute at the entrance to his parking lot, refusing access to two men in official-looking uniforms and Blackwood, who was supervising from his SUV. But Jameson wasn't alone. Word had spread rapidly through Eleanor's extensive network, and dozens of Clearwater residents were arriving, farmers in dusty pickups, shop owners closing early, even teenagers on bicycles, all converging on the hardware store in quiet determination. "This is private property," Jameson was saying as they approached, "and I don't recognize your authority to excavate here." One of the uniformed men thrust papers toward him. "Federal Banking Historical Commission, sir. We have jurisdiction over abandoned banking infrastructure that may pose public safety concerns." "Funny thing about that," called a man emerging from the growing crowd. He introduced himself as Dave Simmons, Clearwater's postmaster for 30 years. "I handle all federal communications for this region, and I've never heard of your commission. Mind if I examine those credentials more carefully?" The federal agents hesitated, clearly unprepared for this level of scrutiny and community resistance. Blackwood emerged from his vehicle, his composed facade beginning to crack. "This is obstruction of a legitimate federal operation," he announced loudly. "Everyone here could face serious charges." "Is that right?" came another voice. A woman in her 60s pushed through the crowd, carrying an iPad. "Because I just got off the phone with the actual federal banking historical department in Washington, and they have no record of any operation in Clearwater, Nebraska." She smiled thinly. "I'm Patricia Henderson, retired federal bankruptcy judge. I still have a few contacts." The crowd murmured, growing more confident as they realized Blackwood's deception. Marcus stepped forward, standing beside Jameson. "I think you should leave, Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly. "Whatever claim you think you have to what's beneath this parking lot, you won't be pursuing it through intimidation or false credentials." Blackwood surveyed the scene, the growing crowd, the exposed deception, the unified community resistance, and made a strategic retreat. "This isn't over," he said as he signaled his men to stand down. "We have legitimate legal interests that will be pursued through proper channels." "We're counting on it," Professor Reinhardt replied calmly. "Proper channels are exactly what we want." As Blackwood and his associates departed, a spontaneous cheer went up from the gathered townspeople. The immediate threat had been averted, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning of what would likely be a complex legal battle over the vault's contents. Eleanor Caldwell approached, her eyes bright with approval. "Walter chose well when he left his legacy to you," she told Marcus. "He always said it would take someone with both roots in the land and vision for the future to understand what he'd found." Looking around at the community that had rallied so quickly to protect its heritage, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility beyond the grinding struggle of his failing farm. The discovery beneath Jameson's parking lot offered not just potential financial salvation, but a connection to something larger, a legacy of resilience and community, self-reliance that resonated deeply with his own values. As the crowd began to disperse, Jackson appeared at his side. "Dad, I've been thinking," he said earnestly. "Whatever's in that vault, it was meant to help people weather hard times, right? To keep a community going when the regular systems failed?" When Marcus nodded, his son continued, "That sounds a lot like what we need right now, doesn't it? Not just for our farm, but for lots of people around here struggling with changing weather. Big corporate competition, all of it." Marcus looked at his son with newfound appreciation for the young man he was becoming, someone who could see beyond immediate self-interest to broader community needs. Just like the bankers who had created the contingency vault nearly a century before. "You're right," he agreed softly. "And I think that's exactly what Walter was hoping we'd understand." As night fell over Clearwater, the impromptu defenders celebrated their small victory at the local diner. But the greater challenge remained how to legally secure the vault's contents and ensure they served their intended purpose in a modern context. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, historians, perhaps even legitimate government officials. The quiet rural town was about to become the center of a precedent-setting case that could reshape understanding of historical financial instruments and community economic resilience. For Marcus Donovan, third-generation farmer and reluctant inheritor of Walter's Metal Salvage Yard, the path forward was becoming clearer. Whatever financial benefit might eventually come from this discovery, its true value lay in the model it represented, a reminder that communities could create their own economic lifeboats when mainstream systems failed them. He looked across the diner at Jackson, animatedly explaining some technical aspect of the brass disc to Eleanor and her friends, and felt a surge of pride. Through this unexpected inheritance, his son was discovering something perhaps more valuable than financial security: the power of community, the importance of standing firm for principle, and the satisfaction of being part of something that transcended individual gain. The brass disc that unlocked the vault was more than just a key to hidden treasure. It was a symbol of an alternative approach to economic survival, one based on mutual support rather than exploitation, that had quietly sustained Clearwater through its darkest hours. And now, nearly a century later, it might do so again. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Walter Donovan's apartment as Marcus awoke, his mind already racing with plans for the day ahead. The events of the previous evening, the community rallying to protect the excavation site, Blackwood's retreat, the revelations from Eleanor and her friends had created momentum, but also raised the stakes considerably. Jackson was already up, as usual, hunched over Walter's desk with several journals open and a legal pad covered in his neat handwriting. The boy looked up as his father entered, his eyes bright with excitement. "I think I figured out something important about the vault, Dad," he announced. Uncle Walter's later journals mentioned finding old newspaper articles about a fire at the bank president's home in 1927, just weeks before he died. The fire destroyed his personal papers, including what Walter believed were the original access instructions for additional compartments in the vault. "Additional compartments?" Marcus asked, pouring himself coffee from the pot Jackson had already brewed. "The main chamber we accessed might only be the beginning," Jackson explained, pointing to a rough diagram in one of Walter's journals. "Based on the ground-penetrating radar images and these old blueprints, there's evidence of at least 3 separate secured areas. We only opened the first one." Marcus studied the diagram, recognizing the precision of Walter's research. His cousin had been methodical, documenting every detail and cross-referencing multiple sources. It was the work of someone who understood the significance of what he was pursuing, not for personal gain, but for historical truth. "We need legal protection before we go any further," Marcus decided. Blackwood will be regrouping, probably with more sophisticated tactics this time. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Marcus's phone rang an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Hesitantly, he answered. "Mr. Donovan, this is Catherine Mercer, legal counsel for the Historical Asset Reclamation Group." The voice was professional but tense. "I'm calling to inform you that we filed an emergency injunction this morning in federal court regarding the Clearwater First National Bank assets. A hearing has been scheduled for tomorrow in Omaha." "On what grounds?" Marcus asked, his farmer's pragmatism kicking in despite his limited legal knowledge. "Our organization represents the legal successors to multiple creditors of First National Bank. The deliberate concealment of assets during the bank's failure constituted fraud against these creditors, a situation that isn't extinguished by the passage of time when the fraud itself prevented discovery." After ending the call, Marcus immediately contacted Professor Reinhardt, who had returned to the university the previous night to consult with legal experts. The professor's response was reassuring but cautious. "We anticipated this move," Reinhardt explained. "My colleagues in the law school have already been researching precedents. The good news is that Blackwood's organization has a mixed record in similar cases. They've won some, lost others. The better news is that several foundations specializing in historical preservation and community economic development have expressed interest in supporting our position." "Which is what exactly?" Marcus asked, aware of Jackson listening intently. "That these assets, given their age and circumstances, should be treated as historical artifacts with cultural significance, rather than merely as financial instruments. That would place them under different legal frameworks, ones that prioritize preservation and public benefit over private claims." By mid-morning, Eleanor Caldwell had organized a meeting at the Clearwater Community Center, a modest building that had once been the town's original school. Representatives from the State Historical Society, the university's legal department, and several community development experts joined Marcus Jackson and the growing circle of Clearwater residents invested in protecting their discovery. "The federal hearing is just the beginning," explained Diane Torres, a public interest lawyer specializing in historical preservation. "Blackwood's organization is well-funded and persistent. They've pursued similar cases across the country, usually targeting isolated individuals who can be pressured into settlements. They didn't count on a united community," Eleanor noted, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in public service. "Nor on the specific historical context of these particular assets." As the meeting progressed, a strategy emerged, one that would require detailed documentation of not just the vault's contents, but their historical usage by James Calloway in supporting Clearwater during the Depression. Martha Wilson, the retired physician and town historian, volunteered to compile oral histories from elderly residents whose parents and grandparents had benefited from the Clearwater Community Trust. "We need to establish a continuous thread," Torres advised. "Show that these resources, though technically concealed from banking authorities, were nevertheless deployed for their intended purpose: community economic resilience during financial crisis." While the meeting continued, Sheriff Gunderson arrived with news that validated their concerns. "Just got word from a colleague in Lincoln," he announced. "Blackwood's organization has hired a private security firm, supposedly for evidence preservation, at the excavation site. They'll be here by evening with their own court order." Marcus exchanged glances with Jackson. "Then we need to document the remaining vault chambers before they take control of the site." The sheriff considered this. "Technically, I'm supposed to maintain the status quo until the federal hearing. But as I understand it, your original excavation permits are still valid, and Mr. Jameson still authorizes your access to his property." He smiled slightly. "I can't be everywhere at once, especially with staff shortages. Might take me several hours to respond to any reports about activity at the hardware store." With this tacit approval, A plan was quickly formed. While the legal team prepared for tomorrow's hearing, Marcus Jackson, Professor Reinhardt, and a documentary filmmaker recommended by the Historical Society would return to the vault. Their goal: complete documentation of all chambers before external forces could interfere. By early afternoon, they were back at Jameson's Hardware, the brass disc secure in Jackson's pocket. The temporary concrete seal over the access panel was quickly removed, revealing the shaft leading down to the antechamber they had explored previously. According to Walter's notes, Jackson explained as they descended, "The main chamber we accessed was designated for liquid assets, bearer bonds, gold certificates, and similar instruments that could be discreetly converted to cash. But there should be 2 additional sealed areas containing what he called fixed assets and developmental resources." In the main chamber, they carefully examined the walls, looking for indications of additional access points. The filmmaker, Elena Vasquez, meticulously recorded everything with professional equipment, creating a detailed visual record. "Here," Jackson called, shining his light on what appeared to be another circular indentation, similar to the lock mechanisms they had already encountered. "This matches Uncle Walter's diagram for the fixed assets chamber." Once again, the brass disc proved to be the key, though with yet another configuration of its movable rings. As the hidden door swung open, they found themselves facing a smaller chamber lined with metal filing cabinets and map drawers. "Land deeds," Professor Reinhardt breathed, carefully opening the first cabinet. "Property titles, mineral rights agreements, water access grants, some dating back to territorial days before Nebraska achieved statehood." The scope of what they were discovering expanded dramatically. These weren't just financial instruments, but legal title to significant land holdings and natural resources across the region, properties that had never been claimed after the bank's failure, because their documentation had been deliberately concealed. The bank was assembling a land trust, Reinhardt realized, examining document after document. They were acquiring strategic properties, water access points, transportation corridors, mineral-rich areas not for speculation, but for future community development. A leather portfolio contained a typed manifesto dated 1926, signed by the bank's president and board of directors. "As stewards of community prosperity, we recognize that financial capital alone cannot secure the future of our region. Control of land and natural resources by distant interests has repeatedly proven detrimental to local welfare. The properties and rights secured herein are to be held in perpetual trust for the benefit of Clearwater and its surroundings, deployed strategically to ensure that the fruits of our region's bounty remain accessible to those who cultivate it." They were creating a commons, Marcus said softly, the concept resonating with his farmer's understanding of land stewardship. A shared resource base that couldn't be captured by outside interests. The third chamber, accessed through yet another disc-operated mechanism, contained perhaps the most visionary elements of the bank's contingency. Plan detailed development proposals for regional infrastructure, agricultural diversification, and local manufacturing, all designed to reduce dependency on distant markets and external financing. "This is extraordinary," Elena commented as she filmed. They weren't just hiding assets from regulators, they were creating a complete alternative economic framework, a plan B for when the conventional system failed. As they carefully documented each discovery, Marcus couldn't help reflecting on the parallels to his own situation. His family farm was struggling precisely because of the dynamics these bankers had anticipated a century ago. Consolidation of agricultural markets, extraction of wealth from rural communities, vulnerability to distant financial decisions and climate patterns beyond local control. "Dad," Jackson said quietly, holding a folder of agricultural diversification plans from 1926. "Some of these approaches, the crop rotation systems, water conservation methods, cooperative processing facilities, they're exactly what modern sustainable agriculture experts are recommending now. These people were thinking generations ahead. Their documentation work continued for hours, creating a comprehensive record of the vault's contents before any court orders could restrict access. By early evening, they had filled multiple secure digital drives with photographs, video, and detailed inventories, evidence that couldn't be easily suppressed or controlled. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Gunderson arrived with a warning. Blackwood's security team just checked into the Clearwater Inn. They have paperwork for tomorrow, morning something about securing the site pending the federal hearing. We're just finishing, Marcus assured him. Everything's been properly documented now. The sheriff nodded approvingly. Good, by the way. I've been doing some checking on this historical asset reclamation group. They've been involved in some questionable cases pressuring elderly property owners, making dubious claims about historical assets, usually settling quietly with confidentiality agreements that prevent public scrutiny. They picked the wrong town this time, Professor Reinhardt observed. Back at the salvage yard, they found Howard entertaining an unexpected visitor, a distinguished woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Judge Marilyn Patel. Retired from the federal bench but still active in historical preservation law. Eleanor Caldwell is an old friend, she explained. When she called about your situation, I was intrigued enough to drive up from Lincoln. I've seen similar cases before organizations, attempting to monetize historical financial instruments through legal technicalities, usually at the expense of communities with legitimate cultural claims. Her assessment of their documentation was encouraging. You've established a compelling narrative here, not just of hidden assets, but of a deliberate community resilience strategy that, while unorthodox by modern banking standards, was implemented with clear public benefit intent. Will that matter in court? Marcus asked. Immensely, Judge Patel confirmed. Modern courts increasingly recognize the concept of cultural patrimony, assets with significance beyond their monetary value that rightfully belong to communities rather than individuals or corporate entities. As night fell over Clearwater, the small apartment behind Walter's salvage yard became command central for their legal strategy. Judge Patel worked with Torres and Reinhardt to prepare for the federal hearing, while Eleanor coordinated with her extensive network of community supporters. Martha Wilson arrived with remarkable historical documentation, photographs, letters, and testimonials establishing how the Clearwater community trust had quietly supported the town through decades of economic challenges. We need to be prepared for Blackwood to escalate, Judge Patel warned. His organization has significant financial backing, most likely from investment groups specializing in extracting value from historical financial instruments. They'll try to frame this as a simple property dispute rather than a cultural heritage issue. Marcus stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The stars shone brightly over the salvage yard, a familiar sight to a man who had spent his life working the land beneath those same stars. In just a few days, his life had transformed from the grinding struggle to save his failing farm to leading a community's fight to preserve its economic heritage. Jackson joined him, perching on an old tractor seat that Howard had repurposed as a yard bench. I've been thinking, Dad, he said thoughtfully. Even if we win tomorrow, this is just the beginning, isn't it? Whatever's in that vault, it belongs to the whole community, not just us. That's right, Marcus agreed, proud of his son's perspective. Which means we'll need to figure out how to honor the original intent while addressing modern needs. I've been reading more of Uncle Walter's journals, Jackson continued. He had ideas about that creating an agricultural innovation fund, a community-owned renewable energy cooperative, a regional processing facility for small farmers to add value to their crops instead of just selling raw commodities. Marcus smiled, recognizing the enthusiasm in his son's voice, the same passion that had driven the young man to research alternatives for their struggling farm long before this unexpected inheritance changed their circumstances. "Sounds like you might be the right person to help implement those ideas," he suggested. The federal hearing the next morning in Omaha was tense but decisive. Blackwood's organization presented sophisticated legal arguments about successor creditor rights and financial instrument jurisdiction. But Judge Patel's guidance and Torres's expertise, combined with the comprehensive documentation and community testimony, proved compelling to the federal judge. This court recognizes the unique historical and cultural significance of the discovered assets, the judge declared. While certain financial instruments may retain technical validity, their context is part of a deliberate community resilience strategy during a national financial crisis places them in a special category of cultural patrimony. The ruling established a temporary preservation framework. The vault and its contents would be professionally secured and documented by the State Historical Society, with a special committee established to determine appropriate long-term stewardship. Blackwood's organization was granted limited rights to examine specific financial instruments, but prohibited from removing or claiming them, pending a more comprehensive determination. As they drove back to Clearwater, a weight lifted from Marcus's shoulders. The immediate threat had been averted, though he harbored no illusions that Blackwood and his backers would abandon their pursuit entirely. "We didn't just win a court case today," Professor Reinhardt observed from the back seat. "We established a precedent, one that recognizes community economic heritage as something worthy of preservation alongside more traditional historical artifacts." 3 months later, the Clearwater Community Heritage Foundation held its inaugural meeting in the renovated storefront next to Jameson's Hardware. Beneath the building, the vault had been properly secured and partially restored as a historical exhibit, with a viewing area allowing visitors to witness this remarkable example of rural financial innovation. The foundation's board represented a cross-section of the community, Eleanor Caldwell as chairperson, Marcus as director of agricultural initiatives, and surprisingly, Jackson as youth coordinator and technology advisor. The financial instruments and property rights discovered in the vault had indeed proven valuable, not in the way Blackwood's organization had intended to exploit them, but as the foundation for a community revitalization strategy exactly in line with their original purpose. What made this different from other historical discoveries? Eleanor explained to a reporter from a national magazine doing a feature on rural economic resilience, was that we honored the intent behind it. These weren't just forgotten assets, they were deliberately preserved resources, intended to serve future generations during times of economic transition. Exactly like the one we're experiencing now. For Marcus Donovan, the transformation extended beyond the community to his personal circumstances. The foundation had established an agricultural innovation center on his struggling farm, implementing many of the sustainable practices outlined in the vault's development plans while incorporating modern technology. The operation now served as both a working farm and a demonstration site for regional farmers facing similar challenges. Walter's metal salvage yard had evolved as well, with Howard continuing day-to-day operations while sections were converted to a small museum displaying the artifacts Walter had collected over decades, pieces of America's industrial past that told the story of how communities had adapted to economic change across generations. On a warm autumn evening, Marcus and Jackson stood at the edge of their revitalized fields, watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. The drought that had threatened their operation was being addressed through irrigation systems funded by the foundation. Systems designed using both century-old water conservation principles from the vault, documents, and cutting-edge efficiency technology Jackson had researched. "Uncle Walter knew exactly what he was doing when he left you the salvage yard," Jackson observed. "He could have given it to anyone, but he chose someone who would understand what he'd found, not just as a treasure, but as a responsibility." Marcus nodded, thinking about the journey from that first disappointing sight of the rundown salvage yard to the thriving community initiative it had spawned. The brass disc that had unlocked the vault now held a place of honor in the Foundation's headquarters, a symbol of how the past could unlock possibilities for the future when approached with respect and vision. The real treasure wasn't the money or the land deeds, Marcus reflected. It was the model, the idea that communities can create their own economic safety nets, their own development strategies, that we don't have to be passive victims of distant market forces. As darkness fell, the lights of Clearwater twinkled in the distance, a small town that had defied the rural decline affecting so many similar communities. Energized by rediscovering its own hidden history of resilience and self-determination. The legacy of Walter Donovan's meticulous research and the forward-thinking bankers who had created the contingency vault continued to unfold in ways no one could have fully anticipated. But its essential principle remained clear, that economic systems should serve communities rather than extract from them, and that preserving this wisdom across generations was perhaps the most valuable investment of all. For Marcus and Jackson Donovan, what had begun as an inherited metal salvage yard had transformed not just their own circumstances, but their understanding of what was possible when a community reclaimed control of its economic destiny. The struggling farmer and his son had discovered not just a hidden vault, but a pathway toward sustainable prosperity rooted in the wisdom of the past, yet focused clearly on the challenges of the future. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, now bustling with activity as the Foundation's demonstration center, Marcus reflected that some inheritances carried value far beyond their apparent worth, becoming not endings but beginnings. Not burdens but opportunities to build something meaningful that extended beyond a single lifetime. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.